Hi, it's Christina and this is Lazy Days Gardening. Today I want to talk about mulching and why it's so great for soil health, plant health, and weed suppression.
Okay, so why is it important to mulch anyways? I think the most important reason I mulch is to feed the soil. When we feed the soil carbon and nitrogen, which are both in mulch, we are feeding the soil microbiome. We're feeding all of those little plant and animal organisms that live in the soil, and those organisms are producing nutrients that will feed our plants. Therefore, it's also a way of feeding our plants. If we continue to take and take and take from the soil without replenishing those nutrients, then we will have unhealthy plants. And so feeding the soil is so important for our overall garden health. Another reason it's really important to mulch our soil is to aid in water retention and decrease our overall watering needs. If we have mulch there, it prevents that water from evaporating from our soil and holds and helps that soil retain water for plants. On the flip side of this, if you live in an area that's really wet, mulching can actually be detrimental to your garden and can increase the number of snails and slugs that are present, which are going to feed on those plant roots. So if you live in a really wet climate, mulching may not be for you. And finally, one of the other really big reasons we mulch in the garden is to suppress weeds. When we're covering up the soil around our plants that we want to grow, we make it harder for those weeds to emerge. It doesn't mean that our garden will be weed-free, but it will decrease the competition our garden plants face from weeds in the garden. There are lots of types of mulch out there, and not all types of mulch are created equal, and different types of mulch are appropriate for different types of gardens. So I'm going to walk you through a few of these mulch types to see what's right for you. The first type of mulch that I want to talk about is one of the most common, and that is straw. And when I say straw, I mean not only oat straw, but also barley and rice. And actually in this video, you'll see corn fodder as well. So any type of seedless stem or stalk, essentially, of a grass or grain plant. Straw is really great because it breaks down really easily and it's easy to mulch with. And it does a good job of feeding the soil. One of the disadvantages of using straw is that in wet areas, it can actually retain too much soil moisture, and then you're more likely to have a slug and snail infestation on your plants. So that's just something to watch out for. And the other thing is, when I say straw, I do not mean hay. Hay is not the same thing as straw. Hay will have lots of little seed heads that are all going to sprout and drive you crazy all growing season. So save the hay for those cows and horses and do not put that on your garden. The next mulch I want to talk about is one of my favorites, and that is to use leaves. Leaves are just so available in many places, and if you have a yard that gets a lot of leaves in the fall, I definitely encourage using them in your garden. They have all of the benefits of straw, and you know that there aren't going to be any weed seeds in there. They're a great place to harbor pollinators, so we aren't removing those pollinators who need a place to overwinter, and they will break down really nicely and just like in the forest floor, right? So leaves are really a great option that is totally free and easy to source. The biggest thing to remember when sourcing leaves, though, is to not use leaves from the walnut tree, because that will actually suppress other plant growth. Another mulching type that works with the natural environment that you're already in is to practice chop and drop. And I also include in this pull and drop. So pulling up weeds that have not gone to seed and leaving them there to mulch the ground. This is a great way to listen to the environment that you're in because weeds are telling us something. Dandelion weeds will grow in a place where the soil is calcium deficient. Quackgrass, as much as I hate it, is showing us that the soil is compacted and needs to be broken up. Weeds will grow in different seasons under different environments because they're telling us that the soil needs something. And if that weed is able to pull up a certain nutrient, like dandelions, for example, and we pull it and remove it, that soil is still deficient in that nutrient. So if we pull the weed before it's gone to seed and leave it on the ground to decompose, it's going to feed the soil with the nutrients that our plants also need. So I really like the chop and drop or pull and drop technique here. It's important, though, to make sure that you are not leaving plants that have the weed seeds still there, because then it's just going to proliferate in your garden. And it's also important to remove diseased plants and any plants that do have rhizomes. So quackgrass, for example, is one to not leave on the soil, at least not leave the rhizomes. You can leave the top part of the plant, but not the roots that are very prolific. The next mulching material I'm covering here are wood chips. Wood chips are actually not really good to use in vegetable gardens. They hold too much carbon, and so they will bind with the nitrogen that's in your soil and keep your vegetable crops from absorbing that nitrogen. So it's important to only use wood chips in our walkways or around plants that are like woody shrubs. Lawn clippings, on the other hand, are a great source of nitrogen. Like leaves, they are a free source of mulch. I've used them in my garden before. The things to look out for with grass clippings are to make sure that you're using dry clippings, not fresh, wet ones. And also that you only apply 1 to 2 inches of grass clippings as mulch at a maximum, because they will get slimy underneath, and that isn't really good for your plant growth. So really, I prefer to use grass clippings in my compost pile, or just to leave them on my lawn to feed my lawn instead of on my garden. Another great source of nitrogen for certain plants, like if you're growing sweet corn or squash, would be to use a living mulch. I wouldn't use a living mulch for most of my vegetables. I would use the vegetables themselves as the living mulch, like with carrots and beets. But if you're growing some of those heavy nitrogen users like sweet corn, a living mulch such as bird's foot trefoil or vetch can be really beneficial in the garden. The things to watch out for are to make sure that the plants that you want to grow are well established before planting a vetch or other ground cover, because they can outcompete the plant that you actually want to grow. But they do provide a lot of the benefits of a non-living mulch, and can then be tilled into the soil at the end of the season. And finally, I wanted to cover the use of black plastic in the garden. Black plastic is a really common mulch. I'm not a big fan of black plastic for a number of reasons, but it does suppress weeds. It does a really great job of suppressing weeds. What I don't like about black plastic is that it does nothing to feed the soil, and eventually it's going to end up in a landfill somewhere. I also don't like that inevitably when we have plastic in our environment, it is leaching microplastics into that environment. And that isn't good for our soil, it isn't good for our gardens or our plants. And so while it might be a really easy fix for weed suppression, it is not, in my mind, the ideal mulching situation. So now that we've gone through all of these different types of mulch that we can use, I want to talk about my preferred method of mulching in the garden, which is called sheet mulching. So basically with sheet mulching, what you're doing is making a lasagna type layering system, except instead of noodles and sauce, you're using cardboard and mulch and compost. So there are a bunch of different types of sheet mulching even, but essentially sheet mulching is just adding layer upon layer of a different type of mulch, whether that's cardboard or newspaper or a natural mulch like straw or corn fodder or compost itself. And so I'll just go through what I've done in the garden this season as one example of how to sheet mulch. So this year, when I was sheet mulching, first I put down a layer of compost. Then I took my boxes and I removed the plastic and broke them down and spread them out along my raised bed. Once I had put down all of my cardboard or paper bags, I did use some paper bags as well, then I put a very thick, probably 4 to 6 inches thick layer of corn fodder. I used corn fodder because last summer was very dry here and there wasn't a lot of straw, but there was a lot of corn fodder. And so that's the mulching material that was most readily available. If I had access to a lot of weed-free compost, I would definitely use compost instead and put down 4 inches of compost on top of those boxes because it's just easier to put seeds into that material. When I'm using mulch in this way, it's typically just for plants that have been started. So when I'm mulching with sheet mulching and I want to just direct seed into that mulch, then I put a layer of compost on because that's much easier for seeds to germinate in. They will not do well if you just plant them into straw on top. So after adding the mulch, then I waited a few weeks. I would have done this last fall, but I did put down my mulch this spring. And by waiting a few weeks through rain and watering the raised beds, the cardboard boxes and that bottom layer of corn fodder were able to decompose and become soft. Once that happened, I was able to dig a small hole right where I was planting my transplants. And in that hole, I put some extra compost because I'm using this type of mulch mostly for my tomatoes, my peppers, my eggplants, the nightshades that really require a lot of nitrogen. And I planted my transplants directly there. And that's it. That's easy.